All right, let's talk about the SSC MTS exam from February 16th. If you were in that second shift, you know what we're about to get into. It was the talk of the town, right? So in this breakdown, we're going to dig into what made that paper so incredibly tough, and more importantly, what you can learn from it for your future prep.
So let's get right to it. Was this really the toughest exam shift we've seen? Was all the hype justified? Well, from everything we've heard from students, the answer is a resounding yes. And when you actually look at the questions, you'll see exactly why.
Yeah, this quote pretty much nails it, doesn't it? The most difficult shift, filled with questions most had never seen before. I mean, the general studies section, it was like navigating a minefield. It was just packed with these really obscure static GK questions that had even the top-tier, most prepared students completely stumped.
Okay, so to really understand what happened, we need to dissect this paper piece by piece. Let's look at the anatomy of the questions they asked. And we're going to start with the arts and culture section, because honestly, this is where things first went off the rails for a lot of people.
Right, so jumping into that first section, uncommon arts and culture, this was everyone's first clue that this wasn't going to be a walk in the park. The questions were so out there, so specific, it felt like they were pulled from a totally different syllabus. It was a real shock to the system.
For example, take this one, the Chuhara dance. I mean, seriously. Unless you've spent weeks doing a deep dive specifically on the folk dances of Himachal Pradesh, you were probably just staring at this question, scratching your head. It's just not something you'd typically cover.
And it didn't stop there. It wasn't just about memorizing a name. Look at the Indra Jatra festival question. You didn't just need to know what it was, you had to connect it to the Newar community in Sikkim. That's 2 layers of very specific knowledge for one question. That's a whole other level of detail.
And there's Diruith here, Kali. Wow. I mean, just saying the name is a challenge, but this is a perfect illustration of what they were doing. This is such hyper-specific knowledge that, even many people from Kerala might not be familiar with it. It's a brilliant example of how tough this paper was.
And it wasn't just folk culture they were digging into. They went deep into classical music, too. You had questions about specific artists like Shruti Setalikar Katkar, and you had to know which specific school of music or gharana she belonged to. Again, super niche stuff.
And how about this one? They even asked about instrument classifications. You were expected to know the traditional Indian musicology term for aerophones or wind instruments, which is Sushir Vadya. I mean, who would have thought you'd need to know that? It just goes to show how incredibly deep they were willing to dig. Okay, so this pattern of really obscure questions wasn't just in the arts and culture section. Not at all. Let's move on and see how it played out in history, because it was pretty much the same story there, a focus on really specific, often overlooked historical facts.
Yeah, exactly. You could have memorized all the major Mughal battles, the big famous ones like Panipat, and it wouldn't have helped you here. Nope. This exam wanted the nitty-gritty details of a very specific campaign from 1565 against the kingdom of Garha-Katanga. Talk about going off the beaten path.
And ancient history was no different. You couldn't just have a general understanding of the Mauryan Empire. They wanted you to know the exact administrative setup of Pataliputra, according to Megasthenes, right down to the specific number of committees. 6! The level of detail is just incredible. And just when you think, okay, it can't get any more specific than that, boom! They hit you with colonial-era legal history, the Sardan Nizamat Adalat. I mean, come on, that is definitely not a household name, is it? It's a deep cut from history that most people would never come across. And this right here, the question about the Mutaraya family, perfectly sums up their strategy. It shows the focus on really deep regional history. It's sending a clear message. Knowing the big, major dynasties isn't enough anymore. You've got to know the minor ruling families and their allegiances too. But wait, here's where it gets really interesting. And this is the part that made the exam so tricky. It wasn't all impossible curveballs. In fact, mixed in with all those ridiculously hard questions were some very predictable, very standard GK topics. So you'd be struggling through a question about a medieval court system, and then suddenly you'd get one of these. Questions about the rediscovery of India, the tomb of Aitama Dudala, the Arya Samaj. I mean, these are the bread and butter topics. These were the questions that were probably on your study list, and they must have felt like a huge breath of fresh air. And this is the real key to understanding this paper. It wasn't just that the obscure questions were hard. It was the insane contrast. It was the mental whiplash of going from a question about the Thurwa Thurakali dance to a straightforward one about the Arya Samaj. That unpredictable mix is what made this shift so brutal.
Okay, so what's the big takeaway here? What does this all mean for your preparation? How do we use this analysis to make sure you're ready for whatever they throw at you next time? Let's talk strategy. Let's build a new study playbook.
All right, here it is, your new 4-step game plan. First, you absolutely have to diversify your static GK sources. The standard textbooks are not enough anymore. Second, focus on regional culture. I'm talking lesser-known dances, festivals, local history. You've got to go deeper. But, and this is crucial, third, you still have to master the core topics. Don't neglect those high-probability questions. And finally, number 4, you've got to be adaptable. Don't panic. You have to go in knowing that some questions will be unpredictable. Your job is to not let them throw you off your game.
Look, this shift wasn't a one-off. It's a clear signal, a trend. The game is changing. So the real question we're left with is this: how is this trend of unpredictable questions going to change the way you prepare? It's something to really think about.